The goddess of wisdom, of industry, of scholarship, of architecture, of societal progress and philosophy, and ultimately the protection and stability of the city. Civilization is the sum of her gifts. All that we have built beyond nature is what Ephara has blessed, and with her by our side, we will build a monument to span the ages. Ephara, god of the Polis, is a powerful, subtle commander that often flies under the radar. She is 2 of any colored mana, a blue and a white for a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god. Ephara has the usual Theros godly abilities. She's indestructible, and she's not a creature unless your devotion to white and blue is at least 7. This of course means that unless you have a total of 7 blue and or white pips in the mana costs of your permanents, including the 2 Ephara herself brings to the table, then she's just an enchantment and cannot attack or block. But most importantly, she has the triggered ability, at the beginning of each upkeep, if a creature entered the battlefield under your control last turn, draw a card. That draw ability is the linchpin of this deck. Blue-white is the color pair of control, but control has some real problems in multiplayer. Answering threats 1-for-1 with counters or targeted removal isn't the best way, if any, to win the game when there's multiple opponents. If I counter one player's spell or kill their creature, they're down a card and I'm down a card, but my other opponents are sitting on the sidelines laughing. We plan to overcome this limitation by drawing an overwhelming number of cards, playing politics, and controlling the board with wraths that don't touch our indestructible goddess. Her draw ability scales in multiplayer, so if we can build around it, we'll be drawing tons of extra cards. The first creature we play each turn, including our opponent's turns, is effectively a delayed cantrip, drawing us a card on the next upkeep. So let's begin with draw engines. Fortunately, there's critical mass of cards that make triggering Ephara's ability easy, and these will be our draw engines. Salt Skitter is a weird card that works amazingly well in this deck. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, it skitters away to hide in exile, and then comes back at the end of the turn. The net effect of this is that whenever anyone plays a creature, you get to draw on the next upkeep with no effort on your part whatsoever. The new Fairy Artisans from C16 has the same draw power in a different way. It creates a token copy of each creature your opponents play, but you only get to keep the latest one. This might net you some useful enter the battlefield effects or a disposable blocker, but the extra card draw you'll accumulate is the point of running this card. You get to keep the last token made before the artisans leave the battlefield, so take advantage of that. The next class of draw engines are token makers, preferably activated abilities that we can use every turn for maximum draw. Unfortunately, the going rate these days seems to be 4 mana for a tiny creature token, and that means it's just too much to be doing all the time, so our options are scarce. Mobilization lets us pay just 3 mana, Sacred Mesa is even better at 2 mana, and the need to sack a Pegasus on upkeep barely matters when all we want is the draw. Luminarch Ascension is the best such token producer, but it creates a little minigame where your opponents have to keep damaging you to stop it from coming online. If you manage to survive, however, your reward is the ability to create a 4/4 angel for just 2 mana, which is absolutely insane. Tolarian, Sky Summoner, Docent of Perfection, and Monastery Mentor create tokens when you cast instants, and sorceries, which can work if you're going deep on the counterspell plan. I find I run too many board wipes for these guys to be worth it, but I do run Metallurgic Summonings, which does the same thing as an enchantment. Next, we have creatures that can flicker themselves. Aetherling can pay a blue to exile itself until end of turn, which you can do every turn you have the mana available. Being an activated ability means you can do it in response to board wipes or targeted removal. Whitemane Lion, Deputy of Acquittals, and Stone Cloaker all can flash in, get you that essential enter the battlefield trigger, and then return a creature to your hand. This can save a more useful creature, or you can just sit there flashing one of these in each turn, and having it return itself for the Ephara draw trigger, until you find some action. This gets a bit expensive mana-wise, but having the option is always great. And Stonecloaker at least gives you some graveyard hate along the way. Venser, Shaper Savant, is a more expensive but flexible alternative. He's able to bounce anything, letting you delay a spell or get a troublesome permanent out of the way. Finally, we have creatures that repeatedly flicker other creatures. There are only 3 of these, and they all work differently but in subtle ways. Mistmeadow Witch is the cheapest to play, but its ability costs 4 mana, and the creature you flicker doesn't come back until end of turn, so you can't do it repeatedly. Eldrazi Displacer is more expensive, but its ability is only 3 mana, and the creature comes back immediately tapped. Deadeye Navigator, of course, is the other end of this spectrum. Expensive to play, but only 2 mana to flicker itself or the creature you soul bond it with. The downside here is that experienced commander players will kill it on sight because of how absurdly busted it is, even if all we want to do is draw cards. We'll want to include a few sweet creatures to blink with any of our enablers, and what better than Muldrifter and Cloudblazer to draw even more cards. Duplicant exiles creatures unconditionally, Archaeomancer and Mnemonic Wall let us reuse our instants and sorceries over and over again, and Sun Titan gets graveyard value when it attacks as well as when it's blinked. There are lots of fun creatures in blue and white with enter the battlefield effects, and you can always customize and add your favorites, but what I've shown you here is a solid sideline for this deck. What about Ramp in white and blue? Once Ephara gets going, you can quickly start drawing a card each upkeep, but to take advantage of that we need lots of mana. We want to run all the good mana rocks we can get our hands on, including the usual suspects of Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, and so forth, depending on how deep your budget goes. With a 4-mana commander, we want as much ramp as possible that helps us cast our commander a turn early. So 2 mana rocks like Azuria's Signet, Felwar Stone, and Mind Stone are at a premium. Thought Vessel is exceptionally good here, since with all our drawing, we'll quickly brush up against the hand size limit. Even 2-cost mana rocks come into play tapped might be worth a spot. Some ones to consider are Marble Diamond, Sky Diamond, Cold Steel Heart, and finally I've stuck in Gilded Lotus and Thran Dynamo for massive ramp later in the game. Beyond artifacts, our options are slim in blue and white. One old, weird, and expensive option is land tax. The text says that each upkeep, as long as an opponent has more lands than you can search your library for 3 basic lands and put them into your hand. Now you're in Commander, so as long as you're not going first, you're going to have fewer lands than the opponents that went before you until they all start missing land drops. And if you've got any green players, which you likely will, and they're playing things such as Cultivate, which they likely will, you can keep activating land tax pretty much indefinitely. This gets insane if you've managed to get a no max hand size effect, but if not, you can effectively get all the basic lands out of your deck and discard the ones you're not using. Scroll Rack is a combo with land tax since you get to fetch lands. Swap them for the top of your library, and then shuffle them away next upkeep. But let's talk about our primary game plan: control. Not letting anyone do the things they want to be doing. Our best tool for this job is the Humble Board Wipe, which gets rid of all the pesky creatures your opponents keep playing, while not touching Ephara. My build runs a lot of these, but you'll want to tune it to how creature heavy your meta is. Wrath of God is the classic, and the other cheaper Wraths are great since you can hopefully do something else that turn. Day of Judgment, Supreme Verdict, Fumigate, Rout, these can all be cast at instant speed for extra mana, which lets you clear the board before your turn and then be the first to act. Austere Command is a flexible spell that can tailor to hurt your board the least, while Larry Niven's Disc and Planar Cleansing can reset just about everything when the game isn't going your way. Phyrexian Rebirth and Martial Coup wipe the board and give you creatures, which means you can draw with Ephara afterwards, a nice little benefit. We also want counterspells, more as a hedge against combo decks, and really degenerate things than as the primary game plan. With counters, cheaper is better, but this deck has enough mana sinks that you can get away with playing some of the more expensive ones. You want the classic counterspell, and Cryptic Command is always value. Rewind works well with all of our mana sinks, and Render Silent can really shut problem players down. Desertion lets us actually steal the artifact or creature we're countering, which can be a blowout, or at least a draw trigger off Ephara. And similarly, Spell Spell Queller and Draining Whelk are counterspells stapled to creatures that we flash in. Glen Elendra Archmage works like this as well. You get to play her, draw off Ephara, counter an instant or sorcery next turn, draw again for her returning via Persist, and still have a counter up. Warning, your playgroup may already hate you. The other piece here is spot removal for anything problematic that sneaks through your guard. Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile are the classic cheap answers to creatures, and it even hits indestructible ones. Council's Judgment can get rid of anything, even hexproof creatures, so long as you can get the table to agree with your threat assessment. I also really like Curse of the Swine as a flexible mass exile. And if you transmute one of your own tokens into a boar, guess what? You get to draw. White gets lots of artifact and enchantment hate, of which Return to Dust is probably the best. For arbitrary permanents, you're left with enchantments such as Oblivion Ring, Detention Sphere, Imprisoned in the Moon, and the new Cast Out, which is extra valuable instant speed. Finally, while we're not really a Pillow Fort deck, Ghostly Prison and Propaganda shore up weaknesses to getting swarmed. Note that the mana cost in all of these enchantments counts towards your devotion to Ephara, which may or may not be what you want. Talking about these answers, it's worth noting how resilient Ephara is to your opponent's answers, especially when she's not a creature. An indestructible enchantment commander dodges most spot removal, and really only something like Song of the Dryads can get it out of the game in a meaningful way. Manage your devotion carefully lest you get hit by an edict effect, such as Grave Pact, or toughness reductions like Black Sun Zenith. A well-timed activated Ephara, however, can be a giant beater and a force to be reckoned with. We now have all the pieces in place to stop others from winning, but we still need to actually win the game ourselves at some point. Luminarch Ascension was mentioned before as a draw engine, but as it turns out, pumping out 4/4 Angels for 2 mana is a reasonably effective way to close out the game purely with damage. Don't try this too early or the table will punish you, but later in the game, when you have tons of mana available, wait until after a board wipe to play it, and then it shouldn't be too hard to get it online. You can then sit back, protect yourself with all your control elements, and smash face with Angels. Deadeye Navigator and Eldrazi Displacer are not fair cards. There are well-known shenanigans with Peregrine Drake, Palancron, and others that give you infinite mana, but this deck isn't especially looking for that. Our commander doesn't do anything with infinite mana, and this is supposed to be a control deck anyway. Much better to blink Venser, Shaper Savant, and bounce everything anyone tries to play, and then start bouncing all their permanents as well. Draining Whelk also gives you a repeatable counterspell, and Glen Elendra Archmage can keep countering instants and sorceries if you blink her to remove the -1/-1 counter. But my preferred win condition in this deck is Approach of the Second Sun. Now hear me out. I can't really defend it as a good win condition, but it is a fun one. And making a fun control deck, magnifique. You spend 7 mana to play it, gain 7 life, and put it into your library 7th from the top. And then you have to manage to get a hold of it again and cast it to win the game. Aside from Ephara's draw engine, we do have a few tools to help us dig it up earlier. Mystical Tutor can fetch it and put it on top, while Sensei's Divining Top and Scroll Rack can dredge it up for us. Giving our opponents a turn cycle or two to deal with us isn't the most effective way to win, but it is the most thematic way for this control deck. I want to have such a lock on the board with my counterspells and wraths that I can actually get away by winning by casting a 7-mana sorcery Dirtle spell. As always, for lands, we'll want to follow my 2-color commander mana-based video, but with a twist. We're running Eldrazi Displacer, which requires colorless mana to activate its ability, and we'll want to do it multiple times per turn when we get something going. This means we almost have a 3-color deck here, and have to worry about getting sufficient colorless sources just in case we draw the Displacer. Mana rocks like Soul Ring help out, but we still need to tweak our mana base. You'll want to run at least one waste so that when you fetch for basics, you'll have the option of grabbing that. Dual lands that also happen to produce a colorless are premium here. The Darkar Wastes, Nimbus Maze, Mystic Gate are all great examples. We're also happier than usual to run utility lands such as Reliquary Tower, an obvious one given our draw theme, and Springjack Pasture, which can create a goat in a pinch to trigger Ephara's ability, and get us a chump blocker. So you don't want to say bah to that one, huh? Playing Control in multiplayer is actually an interactive political experience. You can't stop everyone, at least not at first, so you have to pick your battles and stay under the radar until it's time to make your move. Ephara's subtle background influence is exactly what we need to make Control viable in a casual competitive meta. You may not make friends, but casting Approach of the Second Sun a second time in front of your helpless group of opponents is worth doing, and you can show them all that civilization will always win in the end. And there's nothing more civilized than Control. I hope very much this video has been of some help to you. What commander deck should I do a tech on next? Let me know in the comments below. And this program was made possible thanks to a sponsorship from Card Kingdom, as well as the Patreon support of viewers such as you. So thank you.